Today, we're going to talk about statutory debt limit, why it's important, why it matters, what's going to happen next week, and the things you need to know. First of all, the statutory debt limit we commonly call in this country the debt ceiling. This is the total amount of money that the government is authorized to borrow. Now, what's not commonly known about this is this basically covers old debt. This is money that's already been spent by the U.S. government, and we're trying to cover past debt. So think of this as you have a wayward teenage child. They have their own checking account, and they have not only run everything out of that checking account, but they're overdrafted several $100s, and they're asking you for money for the prom on top of that. And at some point, after they've done this 100 times this year alone, you're going to say, no, I'm not going to cover that overdraft. You're going to have to pay the consequences yourself, and you don't get to go to the prom, and I'm taking your cell phone away. But unfortunately, the way that our government has worked since at least 1960, in fact, 78 times since 1960, the parents have gone in and covered that overdraft, given the money, and said, you know, here's a few extra bucks for flowers. And by the way, why don't you take the next door neighbor's girl as well and pay for everything for her? It's on us. No problem. I'll get it from your uncle. Uncle Sam. Us. And that's exactly what has been going on in this freaking United States of America government since 1960. 78 times we have popped our debt limit and we have just waived it. Now, to roll this thing back a little bit and tell you how this deal works, constitutionally, the U.S. Constitution, signed in, I think, this particular portion of it, 1778, allowed only Congress, only the United States Congress, to authorize and to spend money. Now, in 1917, Congress needed more money than was being brought in by taxes, and we had to use debt for the first time. We funded debt through what was called Liberty bonds at the time. We had to pay for the First World War that we volunteered to get into. It was a fight between England and Germany and France and Germany, and we got in and we didn't have any money. So we floated that thing with what's called Liberty bonds, long-term debt instruments where we borrowed from the public and then we used that money to pay for the war. 1939, Congress further eroded their own rights, and they gave the rights of the purse, the spending, to the Treasury Department of the United States. They allowed the Treasury Department to basically go ahead and spend whatever they want as long as Congress approved the budget on a yearly basis. And Congress retained the right to put a cap or a debt ceiling. We call it, it's technically called statutory debt limit. They put the right, or they kept that right. So in other words, they'd have the final say so at the end of the day. They were the only signer on the check account at the end of the day, except they gave a rubber stamp to the Treasury Department to pay all of the regular bills. Since then, the Treasury Department is essentially part of the executive branch. So the way our system in the United States works is we have the court system, we have Congress, and then we have the executive branch of the government. Executive branch, president, and all the departments, the money, the spenders. Congress is the approvers, although they're really the ones who approve too much. So we are going to run up against our statutory debt limit, our debt ceiling, probably sometime next week, maybe a little earlier than that. And for the first time in a long time, these guys in Congress have gotten some balls, and they're saying, I am not going to give you statutory, I'm not going to break that limit, $31.4 trillion. Now, keep in mind, the $31.4 trillion is almost double the entire gross domestic product, which is the value of all goods and services in an entire year from everybody and every country in the U.S. It's almost double that. So in other words, we've gone on such a huge spending spree that if we took everything from everybody for a year and a portion, it still wouldn't cover enough to cover what we've already spent. On top of that, Congress keeps authorizing additional budget increases that bypass or go past what we're bringing in. So in other words, our tax money that comes in is not enough. And so we have to go out and float what's called T-bills, T-bonds, T-notes. We sell debt, like the Liberty bonds in 1917. We sell debt to all over the world. And we've become the reserve currency of the world, the most valuable commodity, even probably over gold in most cases, is the U.S. dollar. And so at this point now, the Republicans in the Congress have said, you know what, we're not going to obviate our responsibility, our congressionally, our constitutionally mandated responsibility. we're not going to pay for last year's prom and your overdraft checking account and give you money for this year's prom. It's not happening. So you have to go and show us that this year you're going to reduce your spending, then we'll allow last year's overdraft to be covered and we'll start over again. And so in other words, it's a reasonable request. All we're saying as the Republicans in the House is you got to have a reduction. If we're going to raise $1 trillion, you got to save $1 trillion on this year's expense. They're not even saying we cut everything or that we eliminate anything. They're just saying, if you want this $100 overdraft to be covered, you've got to save $100 in next year's expenses. And the president is steadfast that he will not do that. Most of the Democratic Senate, it doesn't even go that far. They know that we're going to have to, on top of all this, now the parents are drinking and they're alcoholics at home and they're just throwing money around. They got to stop drinking. They got to wake up. They got to take care of their kid who's spending too much money, take care of the overdraft checking account, take care of this year's budget, this year's prom, and nobody can do it. They're not going to be able to do it. So what's going to happen? All right. Moody's, which is probably the top credit rating agency in the world, is saying there's several things that will happen the minute we pop our debt limit. Now, keep in mind, we've never done it. And, you look at a dollar bill, a $10 bill, and it says backed by the good faith and credit of the U.S. government. And that's been true. We've never missed a debt payment, although we're spending, once again, like drunken sailors, we're spending money we don't have. But we have never missed an interest payment. We've never missed anything that the government already spent. Now, keep in mind, the debt limit is for what we've already spent. And so they've got more bills coming in than we have availability. Now, sometime mid-June, there'll be the quarterly tax payments from all the businesses in the country, and that will help alleviate the problem. So essentially, all we're looking at, although that press would have you believe that this, that it's the Chicken Little syndrome, everything's going to die, everybody's going to just, commit suicide at home, there's going to be, horrible problems. By June 15th, this thing should be rectified no matter what, because you've got money coming in from the taxpayers if they pay. And that's the thing. If the government can't pay their bills on June 1st, and if you're IBM, let's say, why would you give the government more money if they're not going to pay you back if you're owed taxes and things like that? So there's a big problem. There's a big concern, and it's legit by the Treasury Department that, if all of a sudden the government stops making Social Security payments and Medicare payments and payments to the military and things like that, and interest payments on their old debt, that people will no longer just stop making tax payments. And there is a potential that there could be a run on the government, essentially. Anyway, Moody's has broken this down and said, here's what's going to happen. Now, what they don't say in their article is the timeline. Is this over a year? Is this within 3 days of the end of the year? That type of thing. There's going to be about 6 million jobs lost if we pop this debt limit, debt ceiling. There'll be about 9% unemployment, up from 3 and a fraction today. There will be 15 trillion, that's with the T, $15 trillion from the stock market loss. That's a third of the entire value of the stock market will go down. That's going to happen pretty quick. And it will push up permanently the costs to borrow money, because no longer will the government have the backup of the good faith and credit of the U.S. government. So we're between a rock and a hard place here. Should we unilaterally just raise the debt ceiling to cover what's already been spent? Biden, as president, has said he will invoke the 14th Amendment, but there's a clause in there that said the debt shall not be challenged. The debt of the United States shall not be challenged. They're taking a broad, sweeping overview of this thing and saying, yeah, that includes past money spent, that type of thing. I don't think it's right. I think this would be defeated on an immediate Supreme Court action. I think the court would hold for the Constitution, not for the president, if that's what he chooses to do. But you got your loggerheads here. You got the president saying, listen, I'm not going to cut a penny. I'm not going to even agree to later on cut any money. And the Republican House members are saying, we're not going to approve your old bills unless you guarantee you're going to reduce your debt to start covering some of this deficit spending that you have been doing. Now, inflation is entirely, in my opinion, this is a whole different webinar that we'll talk about. It's entirely laid at the feet of the Treasury Department. We create our own inflation. It's not that values of Coca-Cola have gone up and gas is expensive, which they are. It's because the government printed a lot of money. And they did that by selling debt, and they print money and they send it all out. That's what causes inflation. But what this will do is it will definitely cause more inflation. It will cause, in my opinion, three main things to happen. Number one, all interest on all instruments of any kind, whether it is a car loan or a house loan or credit cards or anything, they'll go up immediately once we pop the debt ceiling. Number two, there will be a big chunk of unemployment. There'll be a lot of people who won't get paid. And the main people who won't get paid are people who get a check from the government, which is a large percentage of the population. There's the military, there's Social Security, there's interest on old debt, there's people we owe money to, there's businesses that have overpaid or individuals that have money coming back from the government in terms of they overpaid last year's taxes, they're asking for the refund. None of that stuff will get paid. And then we're going to have a longer term effect. But, and this is where this thing gets crazy, I believe that this whole thing is actually is going to be a brush fire designed to cover what I think is coming by July. And I think they'll use this as an opportunity to do it. And it's called digital currency, or CBDC, central bank digital currency. The U.S. government will come in and say, you know what, because everybody is afraid and panicked and because of all this, because we didn't raise the debt ceiling, we're going to seize the money supply. We're going to take what all you've got in your account and we're going to give you essentially a debit card. All your money will be controlled through the government's what's called their FedNow program, central bank digital currencies. Lots of the countries in the world are doing this thing. It gives them huge oversight and it will prevent future bank runs. I mean, that is the one good thing about central bank digital currency, because you won't be able to get your money out. If the government says this next week, you can't take any money out of your account, we're freezing them, you can't go down to your local Bank of America and say, I want my money today and get it. You'll be frozen from doing that permanently. It will never happen. But in addition to that, the CBDCs, specifically the FedNow, are programmable currencies. That means that they can monitor everything you spend money on. And if you believe the Twittersphere and all of the conspiracy theorists, which I used to totally discount, and now there's a lot of sense to be made, those programmable digital currencies will be linked to things like your social credit score. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this, but Biden has said we will do that this year. Everybody, they understand what a credit score is now. A social credit score is essentially how well you treat the environment. And the government will be in charge of this credit score, and it will all be tied to your carbon footprint. So if you're at the 17th of the month and you've bought too much meat during the month, and they know that if you buy more meat, it's this much of an increase of your carbon footprint, they're going to cut that card off. They'll say, no more meat until next month. If you've driven too many miles this month, and they've done the calculation that you've exceeded your carbon footprint, your social credit score goes down to a certain level, they're going to cut that card off. Now, other countries have done this, and we have such a focus on all of these environmental issues with, even Kerry, ex-Senator John Kerry, who is our climate ambassador to the UN, he came out the other day and basically he said, the farmers are horrible for this country. We need to get rid of farming because it increases the carbon footprint. Listen, sucker, that's how you get the food that's going into your mouth. That's how you get some of that jet fuel comes from the ethanol grown on the corn in Iowa that you just shat all over. And so you've got these crazy people running this deal, and it all is going to start next week. So what do you guys do? What is the protections? Okay. Believe it or not, one of the safe things, if there's going to be a bank run, which there probably will be additional bank runs if this debt ceiling is reached, and before the government shuts your ability to take money down, they could just declare a banking holiday. They could just say, there is no more. Sorry, you guys have to wait a week till we settle this thing down. Easily done at a presidential level with an executive order under an Emergency Powers Act authority. It happens all the time. They do it every day. They run the government via this fiat. They'll do that at some point, and what you probably need to do is get out some cash. If you got some cash in the bank, keep some cash. Now, if they outlaw cash at some point, as other countries have, there'll be a black market for cash, frankly. And so you should have some of that on hand. Number two, if you've got money in a bank that might be at risk, I would just Google that. Is my bank at risk of a bank run? And I'd say everybody except the too big to fail 10, primarily led by Chase, a JP Morgan Chase. Those guys will probably be safe, but if you've got it in some of these other instruments out there, I would consider moving a chunk of that to U.S. Treasuries. Now, I know that sounds heretical. I'm telling you to, the government's going to screw you, but put the money into the government investment. The number one reason for that is you're only covered to $250,000 on your regular checking accounts per bank. So as an individual, you've got the government by the Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation, FDIC, up to $250 per person, $500 for a married couple. If you've got $1 million in the account, $750 of that could go bye-bye on a bank run. And they'll be just like, sorry, it's gone. And there's no way to fix it. Now, Silicon Valley Bank, First Republic, these banks that had this problem and went out of business over the last couple of months, the government stepped up and covered the limits above 250 on an extraordinary basis. They don't have the money. It's impossible for them to cover everybody. The reason they covered those people is because they're big donors to the political parties and the people in Congress. They covered those people. There's not enough money to cover everybody. So the best thing to do, in my opinion, is take some of that and put it into treasuries. Short term, you can get 5% on a 90-day treasury certificate. And even if you don't get your interest payment, in 90 days from now, at some point you will get it because the government will take care of themselves before anybody else. That's a safe thing. And the third thing I'd recommend doing is look at something like gold, and I would buy physical gold and then put it someplace safe. Now, people are saying, listen, there'll be hordes out running houses, looking for gold, looking for things that could be bought and sold on a barter system. I hear a lot of people talking about they're taking their gold offshore to a country that respects privacy rights, Switzerland, Singapore. They're domiciling their gold in those jurisdictions because they know it'll be safe. Outside the hands of the U.S. government, the Swiss refuse to participate with the shenanigans that the other countries of the world has and always have. They've always been safe place, even during the Second World War. The Nazis stored their gold there. The U.S. stored their gold there. Everybody knew this was the safe place. So those are the things that I'd recommend that you look at doing on a very short-term basis if you've got an opportunity to do that. And, if we come up with some bridge to do this debt ceiling, great. But what I told you about the CBDC is going to happen. I predict, if nothing else, it'll happen sometime during the month of July. And all of a sudden, you'll see a little announcement, we're going to all digital currency. And you're going to have 5 years to tender your cash money back to the government. It will no longer be good after 5 years or 10 years or something like that. We're already putting all of that program together, and that is going to happen. And so you got to think ahead on this deal. This stuff is scary shit. It is happening. It is going to happen. It's how do you prepare for it? That's what you got to do. All right. Sorry for all bad news today. I wish I had more better news, but right now, nobody has got a solution to this thing other than just a massive uprising against the government. If they try and do something like this, I think at the end of the day, the cooler heads will prevail and that there'll be some type of bipartisan deal that, somebody will have to agree to something they don't like. Good solutions are always something where both parties are unhappy. Good compromises, are both parties are a little bit unhappy. Both parties didn't get what they wanted. But in this case, everybody's going to have to give a little bit to make this deal work. So vote against CBDCs when the time comes. You're not going to get a vote, but make sure you talk to your congressmen, your senators, your local people. There's a huge amount, 80-some% of a poll said they are against a digital currency and the elimination of dollar bills, $100, all that kind of stuff, paper money. And make sure you vote with your feet. Make sure you tell everybody you can about this stuff. There's all kinds of stuff out there, legitimate stuff on the internet about how this works. And if you guys want more information, of course, let me know. I'll be glad to post it. But do the best you can, and I will keep you up to date.